Coman, and I'm here with my two counterparts, Jaylee Ismay and McEwen. We are here today to answer the question about how rugby union has embraced professionalism since 1995 and has expanded the elite level Super Rugby. However, much remains to be done to realise professionalism in domestic Australian club rugby. Does the second tier of Australian rugby union propose much development, as this critical comment suggests?
Rugby union has made enormous strides as a sport in Australia over the last 10 years. Culturally, the code has gone through a massive change. It has developed from its origins as an amateur game to arrive at its current state, where it's a fully professional code at the elite level. The inclusion of the Super Rugby tournament has been successful for the code, with mass participation and viewership expanding, as well as the lower tiers creating pathways within the game.
The code has always prided itself on being a game for everyone. It caters for shapes and sizes for men and women and children, for amateurs and professionals, and for players and spectators alike. The National Rugby Championship, the NRC, which is the second tier of union in Australia, has embraced this idea of thinking by allowing a mixture between amateurs, semi-professionals and professional players. The Australian Rugby Union, ARU's previous attempt at a second-tier national rugby competition supporting Super Rugby was the Australian Rugby Championship in 2007, which lasted just one season before being abandoned after losing almost $5 million.
This podcast will expand on these ideals by interviews and academic scholarships to find out if the second tier of Australian Rugby Union requires as much development. First up, we have a quick history of rugby union in Australia, and then under-20s Brumbies player that will speak about his opinions about the NRC. So, how long have you been playing rugby for?
I've been playing since I was about 4 or 5. I can't remember a long time. So, I'm 18 now, so it'd be 13, 14 years of footy.
Yeah.
Time.
And who are you currently playing for at the moment?
Currently playing for the Canberra Royals in the Colts. So, we won the 2015 Premiership. It's pretty good. And currently playing in the Brumbies under-20s.
Okay, so you got a bit of knowledge about rugby?
Just a little.
Could you briefly explain the levels of rugby in Australia and New Zealand?
So Australia, we have three tiers of rugby, and they are club rugby, which is the lowest level. It's quality football, but there's also that next level, NRC, which is your second tier, which in Australia, the NRC is probably a bit, it's a bit of an average, like it's good football, but it's no professional rugby, like your Super Rugby being your top tier. Whereas in New Zealand, it's the similar one, but the second tier is called ITM Cup. Those footballers are probably as good as Super Rugby players and train with a professional program, whereas in Australia, the NRC isn't taken as seriously, I guess is how you put it.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
In the NRC, what issues do teams face, and do any teams have an advantage?
Well, the only advantage I can see is that for one team is the UC Vikings are the only team that are really based out of a Super Rugby franchise. Most of the other teams are based kind of all over the shop, like especially in Sydney, there's 3 teams that are based in different areas and not really affiliated with the Waratahs necessarily. Is probably the major issue, which being affiliated strongly with the Super Rugby team allows them to, I guess, work with a professional program. The UC Vikings get to do that because them having that gives them an advantage, which thus far in the competition, they're undefeated and beating teams by 30, 40 points.
Yeah. And have there been any changes to the NRC in order to make it a better comp? Or?
Well, they actually tried to run NRC last season, so not, or 2 seasons ago, so it's just started up again.
It's new.
So the first time around they tried to do it, it was pretty average. Like, it didn't really take off. There was lack of funding. Nobody was really watching it because they tried to affiliate with Fox Sports, but nobody watched it, so it didn't work too well. And then they ended up canning the whole competition and just going club rugby, super rugby, which is pretty hard to make that jump. It's a whole different level of footy, yeah. But yeah, like, that's probably the major change. And then to make it more interesting, fast-paced, they made points variations, so it's not your classic 5 points for a try, 2 points for a conversion, 3 for a drop goal, and 3 for a penalty. It's a bit different. I haven't looked into it too much. But,
so you don't think it's been very successful?
No, not even this season. It's not very successful. Whereas something like the ITM Cup just kills it. Like, lots of people watch it. Stadiums get packed to watch their games, and there's a lot of money in it as well.
How do you think those issues that you just talked about compare to the ITM Cup?
Well, it just makes it probably a bit harder. Like, the funding's, unfortunately, for that level is extremely necessary. That lack of funding actually is what kills NRC, I guess. Because nobody wants to go watch it because they're not, your top level players aren't really in it, except the UC team. They've got a lot of their Super Rugby players in it. And yeah, so they actually, I'd watch the Vikings over any other game in the NRC, but something like the ITM Cup, you'd go watch any game because there's quality players everywhere.
Why specifically would you think the ITM is better, though?
Just like when you watch the game, they play more professionally, more like a Super Rugby team would play, whereas in the NRC, they just kind of, it's hard to explain. Like,
so you think that ITM is more professional than NRC?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. What do you think contributed to that difference? Why do you think there's such a big difference between the tier in New Zealand and Australia?
Definitely that funding. New Zealanders love rugby a lot. It's probably, I'd consider it their national sport, so they get around it. They really enjoy going to watch, and it's probably why they get so much money in funding.
Yeah.
And it provides like a clear path for lots of players. So lots of players want to get involved. So they've got a lot more numbers in that higher level.
What do you think could be done to improve the second tier in Australia?
Obviously funding helps, and it's always going to help. And then probably if Super Rugby teams get more heavily involved in the ARU, making sure that it's taken as a professional level rather than a club kind of level, because that's what it is in Sydney, in Australia at the moment. It's more of a semi-professional but more club rugby kind of thing. Whereas you want the players in that competition to be vying for Super Rugby positions and in the future Wallabies.
Yeah.
So,
what do you think an improved second tier would have an effect on Super Rugby? Do you think it'd make...
it'd make Australia's quality a lot, like Australia's, I guess, conference more competitive. Like, it just, if you've got those boys coming through that are playing a high level of professional sport, them coming into Super Rugby teams won't be as big as a transition, and you'll get some quality players out of it as well.
Awesome.
Yeah.
That was under-20s Brumbies player Marcus Cutler talking about the NRC, which is the second tier of rugby in Australia. Cutler referred to the UC Vikings and the advantage of being based out of a Super Rugby club, as well as the funding issues that the NRC faces. These problems relate to the need to develop the NRC competition and to reinforce professionalism within the competition. Now we will hear from Blake Jones, who played rugby during high school, and his views on the topic.
Can you please tell me your name and your rugby background?
My name is Blake Jones, and I played rugby union all through high school, but stopped playing afterwards due to being from a regional town in Cooma and the funding was cut.
Do you follow the NRC, and if so, what team do you follow?
Yes, I do, and I go for the New South Wales Country Eagles.
Do you think the NRC is successful as a whole?
No, I don't think so, because unlike the UC Vikings, the New South Wales Country Eagles get no funding from SuperRugby team, as they aren't closely affiliated, therefore they have a lack of staff and professionalism within the playing group. I don't think it is good for the development.
Where do you think the NRC can improve?
First of all, it needs to be televised on free-to-air TV, but to get more people interested, because they are spending so much money and not getting any rewards from it. And if they got viewers from it, then they'd generate money for the NRC in order to achieve higher ranking coaches and player interested. And I think they could get rid of the NRC altogether and put the money towards the already highly popular SuperRugby or grassroots.
That was former high school rugby player Blake Jones talking about the negative viewpoints about the NRC, which is the second tier of rugby within Australia. Jones referred to the lack of big budgets within smaller clubs, which ultimately rely on volunteers, and how development and funding should be focused on the already developed Super Rugby to make the game even better when comparing it to other countries, and or have more expenditure focused on grassroots levels to expand the game at a lower level. Next up, we have Eda discussing the new changes to the NRC.
To change and develop the NRC, the ARU has implemented a new point system and the marquee players. The IRB approved the ARU submission for the NRC to implement a point system that reduced the points for penalty goals and drop goals to 2 points and increases the points for a conversion to 3. However, tries remain at 5 points. Along with this point change, the ARU introduced marquee players in 2015. Qantas Wallabies representatives will be aligned with the clubs of the NRC. The NRC teams were asked to nominate players to the ARU that they were seeking for their allocation. For example, the North Harbour Rays marquee player is Michael Hooper of the New South Wales Waratahs. The adding of marquee players and changing of the point system helps to make the game more interesting, with the marquee players adding a more competitive edge to the teams that don't have a Super Rugby franchise affiliate, therefore increasing the success rate of the NRC and elevating it closer to the level of what the ITM Cup is at. In conclusion, the NRC will open doors to existing country players that have been hidden to lack of exposure before, and Australian rugby will be better for it. The competition is constantly changing and evolving as rules have been learned and adapted to benefit the viewing public. It is a great competition which has the potential to take some viewers away from other codes.
As the NRC is a hybrid combination between amateurs and professionals, it will help to unearth some hidden gems who will benefit from training and spending time with full-time players, which will ultimately dramatically improve the playing standard and depth in Australia.
Our group's answer to the question, Rugby Union has embraced professionalism since 1995 and has expanded at the elite Super Rugby level. However, much remains to be done to realise professionalism in domestic Australian club rugby. Does the second tier of Australian Rugby Union requires much development, as this critical comment suggests? We believe that through the evolution of professional rugby, it has become evident that we desperately need a legitimately competitive tournament that gives exposure to a new generation of player who otherwise would be lost to the game. A tournament to develop, harness and foster our own talent.